Hi everyone, and a big warm welcome to Brush and Bubbles. My name is Lara, and today I'm going to be taking you all through step by step of a canvas painting. Firstly, I just want to say, please don't worry if you haven't painted ever or in a really long time or even since school, because I'm going to be showing you everything here on my canvas, breaking it down into step-by-step chunks, and you can simply follow along from the comfort of your own house. So today we'll be painting a landscape scene of the London skyline. And this is a lovely painting to do because there are a few different elements to it. We're going to start by doing the sky and then the water. We'll then be having a short break and going in and doing our London skyline silhouette. So please feel free to change up the colours for this painting. You don't have to follow the colours that I'm doing. I'm going to go for more of a blue sky blended down into like a sort of sunset shade. But if you wanted to, you can just do a blue sky or a really abstract, colourful sky, or even more of a stormy sky. So before we get started, I'm just going to talk you through what you'll need to create the painting at home. I would start just by covering up your table with some tablecloth or old newspaper. You'll need a canvas. I'm using an 8x10 size canvas and I'll be painting in landscape today, but if you want to, you can always flip your canvas around and paint in portrait. You'll need a couple of different size brushes. I've got a medium square shaped brush and then a smaller pointy brush for all of the details. I've also got here a pencil, which I'm going to be using just to very carefully sketch in where we want our skyline to go, and then we'll be going in and filling it all in with paint. So I just make sure you have a pencil on standby. You'll then need some kitchen towel, a pot or a glass of water, a palette to pop all of your paints in, and then your acrylic paints. Once we get started, I'll be showing you which paint colours I'm using and you can simply apply the same to your palette. But like I mentioned before, please feel free to go rogue and change up the colours that you're using for your own painting. I've also got here a small espresso cup, which I'm not going to be using as an espresso cup, but I am going to be using it just to draw around the base, just to get a nice circle for when we come to doing our London eye. So I would have a little look around your house and just grab a few objects which you could just draw around for the circle. You might just want to have a few different sizes so that you can then decide which size works best for your skyline. So just have a few of these or a few other objects just here ready to go for when we get to that section. I would just set yourselves up, make sure you're nice and comfortable and relaxed. You can go grab yourself a drink and then we will jump straight in to our London skyline painting. In my paint palette, I have white, blue, pink, yellow, green and black. If you don't want to use pink, you can always use red instead. To start with, all we simply want to do is mix up a very light shade of blue. And all we're going to do with this colour is simply draw in where we want our horizon line to be. So this is where the silhouette of our city is going to sit. So for this, I would just pick up your smaller brush, give it a dip in the water, just to loosen up the bristles, and then you can just gently dab it on your kitchen towel. We're then going to mix up a very light shade of blue. So for this, I'm going to pick up some white paint and move it over to a different dish on my palette. And then I'm just going to pick up a tiny little bit of blue. You don't need to wash off the brush or anything like that. And then just give it a really good mix into that white. I then suggest just adding a drop of water into this mixture. It just allows the paint to be a little bit more fluid when we come to drawing in our line. So a tip I want to show you straight away before we get started with our painting is how to prepare your brush. So this is going to be really useful for when we come to drawing and painting in the silhouette of our city. So what I do is, as you can see here, I've picked up quite a lot of this blue. And then just find a spare bit of your palette and push the bristles of the brush down onto the palette. And all we're going to do is twist the handle of the brush and almost drag the brush along the palette so it leaves a little trail. And it will just get rid of any excess paint from your brush and leave the bristles in a nice peak, just so you have more control with what you're creating. Equally, you can just dash the excess paint off on a spare bit of palette to prepare the bristles. So once you've prepared your brush with this light blue shade, just move over to your canvas. And this is where you can decide where you want your city to sort of sit. Now, what I tend to do
is find roughly where the middle part of the canvas is, and then bring the line down slightly, just because our city buildings are going to sit just above that line. So we just want to allow enough space to have nice sky behind the buildings. So I'm just going to draw a line just under halfway down the canvas, all the way across. Just press lightly, and do not worry if this line isn't straight or neat, just because it's just a guideline for us to know where we're bringing our sky down to. We're going to neaten it all up later. So once you've got that line on there, I would just wrap it around the sides of the canvas, just so we cover up the sides and the top and the bottom of the canvas, so that when it goes on the wall, you don't need to frame it. So as soon as you're happy with that line, and please don't worry if it's wobbly and not straight, because like I said, we are going to be going back into it. We just want to wash off our small brush in the water and just pop it back down on your kitchen towel, since we won't be needing it for a while. We're then going to move over to our medium brush, and again I would just dip this in the water, give it a little tap on the bottom just to loosen up the bristles, and again just dab it on your kitchen towel. We're now going to move on to the fun bit of the painting, which is creating the colours for the sky. So this is totally up to you. You can do any colours and shades that you want, any patterns that you want. Some people like to be a lot more neat and just do very swooping motions with the brush going from side to side across the canvas. Other people like to be a little bit more abstract with the shapes that you use for your sky, just so you can have a bit more texture in there. It's totally up to you, and the nice thing is about this is you can try both of the different techniques. You can try giving it a swoop across, see if you like it, and if you want to sort of mess it up a little bit, you then can afterwards. All we're going to do for this is start with the darker shade first. So I'm going to go for a slightly darker blue, blend it down into a lighter sky blue, and then I'm going to move down into more sunset shades, so more of the pinks and then the yellowy oranges at the bottom. But like I've mentioned before, this is your painting. You can do any shades and colours that you want. You might just want a blue sky going from a darker blue to a lighter blue. You might want to go for more of a red sky, or you might want to go for more of a stormy sky. So it's totally up to you what colours that you make for this. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to start mixing up my first colour. So I'm actually going to use the same dish here I had for the first line that we drew, and I'm just going to pick up a couple of scoops of this blue paint, and I'm going to mix it in with the lighter blue I had underneath. By adding a little bit of white paint or a lighter pastel coloured paint to your mixture, it tends to make the paint more opaque, so less see-through. So I might just add a tiny little bit more white to this. I'm just scraping off the excess paint on the side of that dish. Just pick up a little bit more white and just mix it back in. Again, everyone's colours are going to be slightly different. As long as you're happy with the shades that you're making, that's really all that matters. Again, I would just suggest adding a drop or 2 drops of water into this, just to make the paint a little bit more fluid. Just give it a very good mix. And when you're ready, we're going to move over to our canvas. So what we want to do with this shade is focus it more towards this top section. I'd say probably like the inch from the top. And what I like to do is be really swoopy with my brush strokes. So I sort of crisscross them, as you can see here. But like I mentioned, if you want to go for a really smooth sky, just drag the paintbrush bristles all the way along the canvas. Almost allow the bristles of the brush to go off the edge. Just blending it in, covering up any of that background and picking up more paint when you need to. But if you like the sort of swooping motions with the brush, which I think is actually quite nice when we're coming to paint a sunset sort of sky, just because it adds that texture in there, then just sort of crisscross the brush along the canvas, and the bristles of the brush just help to create that tone and texture. Again, don't forget to wrap this paint around the sides of the canvas as well and along the top. So just give it a bit of paint along the sides and the top. Now we're going to be mixing our next colour into this so we can have a nice blended look to our sky. So I would just bring it down a little bit further just because this is where it's going to be blended into the next shade, just so we don't lose any of this. And then whenever you're ready, we're going to just mix up our next shade. So all I'm going to do is pick up some of this colour I've just used and I'm going to move it over to a different dish, just a little bit. And to this, I'm going to add some more white. I want it to be more of a pastel shade of blue. And when we mix it next to our last shade, we can sort of see the tone difference. Again, I'm just going to add a little drop of water to this mixture. And whenever you're adding the water, just make sure you're really mixing it in there. We still want the paint to be pigmented. We just want a slightly lighter consistency with the paint. And then as soon as you're happy with this, we're just going to go ahead and add this to our canvas. So what I like to do, and as a little tip, I would suggest adding this colour underneath that previous shade. So you almost have a line, and just get all of that paint off the brush. Bring it down about an inch, half an inch. And then when you feel like most of your paint is off your brush, to help blend it, you can then overlap the previous shade. And I'm just using a light touch, and I'm still doing quite crisscrossy movements with my paintbrush. But you'll start to see it blend into that previous colour. It just helps us not to have a stark line in the sky. And if you've gone for the more swoopy backwards and forwards effect, and if you've gone for more of a backwards and forwards swooping effect, you can just carry on blending that sky just over that line. And it's quite nice if you see a few different streaks and tones and textures in there, because we want there to be lots of nice movement within our sky. So what I'm going to do with this colour is again just bringing it down a couple of centimetres just so our next shade can blend into it and we don't lose any of that colour. So I'm just bringing it down slightly. Again, wrapping it around the sides of the canvas. And then all we're going to do now is exactly the same thing. We're just going to lighten up this shade even more. So all I'm going to do to this colour is just add some more white paint and give it a really good mix in. So this should be more of a pastel sky blue kind of shade. And then you can also add a little bit of water to it again, give it a good mix. And then as soon as you're happy with that sky blue shade, we're going to do exactly the same thing again. So just paint this new colour underneath that line of the last one. You should be able to see it sort of lightening up slightly as we get further down towards the sunset. So just get rid of most of that paint off your brush, just bring it down slightly, maybe half an inch. And then once most of your paint is off your brush, you can just carefully swoop this lighter blue into that previous colour. So don't be afraid to overlap that previous colour. That's the trick here. And sometimes I feel like it's better to work quicker just because we don't overthink where we're marking the canvas. We just sort of go with it. Again, remember to wrap it around the sides. So again, I'm just bringing this down about a centimetre, just so our next shade can blend in to this blue and we don't lose any of this blue colour. So I'm now going to move on to mixing up more of a pinky sort of tone to graduate the sky down into a sunset shade. If you're loving the blue shades, you don't have to do this bit. You can just go for blue skies, and all I would say is just keep lightening up this shade just by using some more white paint until you get to our horizon line. However, if you do want to start introducing a little bit more of those sunset shades, I would just wash off your medium brush really well in your water. Give it a tap on the bottom just to get most of that paint off it. And then give it a good dry on your kitchen towel, and just be careful of the bit of paint that sort of stays on the metal part of the brush. So just rub that off as well. So what I'm going to do now is make a very light pink colour. So for this I'm going to start with some white as my base. So I'm just picking up some white, moving it over to a different dish. And then I'm just going to add a little bit of pink to it and give it a good mix. Like I mentioned before, you can always do this with red if you prefer a sort of more reddy pink tone. If you want to, you can actually make an orange instead, so you could mix up red and yellow together and make an orange tone. So it's completely up to you what colour you want to make for this part of the painting. So again, I'm just going to add a little drop of water to this, mix it in, and essentially we're just going to do exactly the same thing, even though we're moving on to a different shade of paint. I'm just going to paint this pink colour underneath that light blue. Again, just getting most of the paint off my brush onto the canvas, and I'm going to bring it down about ½ an inch, just over that. Still using sort of swoopy, crisscrossy motions with my brush. As you can see, I'm sort of going like that with my brush, and you can either use the thicker side or you can turn it and actually use the thinner side if you want to get sort of thinner swoops. Wrapping it around the sides again. And then as soon as you're ready, what you can start to do is blend this pink shade up into that blue. Again, just using crisscrossy motions with your paintbrush. And it's quite nice to see a few sweeps of this pink in this blue section. So don't be afraid of overlapping the pink with the blue. I want to make sure we're getting that nice textured sunset sky look. And you'll see as it blends in with that blue, it sort of almost gives it a purple kind of tone, which is quite nice. If you want to, you can be quite thick with your paint, so you can just add quite lumpy bits of paint on there. And I've just, as you can see, given it a swoop up into that sky. When you look at photos of sunsets, what's nice about painting them is there are so many different tones and textures and movement in the sky. So actually it's a lovely element to paint because we can just be really free with what we're doing. We don't have to overthink it. We can be really abstract with the paintbrush if we want to. So I'm just gently sort of swooping in some of this pink up into that blue just to give it a little bit of movement and colour in there. And then if you want to, you can just bring this pink down a little bit more, because we're going to blend our next shade up into this pink, just like we've been doing for the rest of the colours. So what we're going to do now is move on to our next colour. And for this, we want to make a sort of peach tone. So all I'm going to do is pick up some of this pink. And I'm just going to move it to another space on my palette. And then I'm going to add a tiny little bit more white to it. And then introduce a very small amount of yellow. So I'm just dipping the very corner of my brush into the yellow. And then I'm going to mix this up. And you should get quite a nice nude peach tone. So that was just the pink from our palette, a little bit of white and a little bit of yellow. Again, if you want to, you can just add a drop of water to this. When you're happy with your shade, we're just going to do exactly the same thing again. We're just going to paint it underneath that pink. Get most of that paint off your brush, bring it down a little bit. I'd say probably about ½ an inch. We still want a little gap here just because we're going to be adding more of a yellow tone to the bottom of our sunset. And then whenever you're ready, we're just going to again swoop it up into that pink shade. So again, we might just have swoops of this peach just overlapping in that pink section. I think the trick here is not overworking it. Sometimes it's quite nice to see a few different tones and textures in there, and if we overwork it, we sort of overly blend it. So just keep having a little step back from your painting just to see what you've got. As soon as you're happy with that small section of the peach tones, you can just wash off your brush again. And dab it on your kitchen towel. We're now just going to move on to mixing up the last shade for our sky. So this is going to be a very light yellow. So I'm just going to start by picking up some of the white, moving it to a different dish, and then just picking up a small amount of yellow and mixing it into the white. So you get a very pastel shade here. And just make sure you're mixing up enough to cover up that section. So if you haven't mixed up enough, just mix up a little bit more. And then with this, we're just going to paint it underneath that peach. Again, just getting all that paint off the brush, bring it all the way down to this line that we originally drew. You can actually even overlap it slightly. And then once your paint's off your brush, that's when you can start overlapping it and blending it into that peach shade. And because the peach shade should still be damp from when we applied it, it should blend in quite nicely and sort of mix together. Again, you can just add swoops of this yellow kind of up into the section. If you want to, you can even bring it a bit higher into the pink. Just to show the reflection of the sky, or the sun in the sky even. Just adding a few swoops of this a little bit further up, just because I like the look of the texture kind of sky. And if you're happy with this being your last colour for your sunset, then leave it. If you wanted to brighten it up a tiny bit more, I would just pick up a little bit more yellow and mix it back in to that pastel yellow just to brighten it up slightly. And then with this, you can just add little sort of touches of it just along that horizon line, blend it into that previous shade. Again, just using quite sweepy motions with your brush. You can even bring it up again, sort of underneath some of those pastel shades of yellow, just to add a tiny bit more warmth into our sunset. And just remember to wrap this shade around the sides. And don't worry about this line down here because this is all going to be covered up by our buildings. Just adding a few little swoops of this yellow up into the section where it's sort of the pink meets the blue. And then whenever you're happy with your sky, we're just going to wash off our medium brush again, because we're now going to move on to painting in the colour for our water. So I just dab your brush off on your kitchen towel. And what we're going to do is we're just going to go back to that colour that we had for the top of our sky. So I would just pick up this blue with your medium brush. And we're going to focus this towards the base of our sort of canvas here. And essentially we're just going to add a few different tones to our water. And we can be really choppy and free with our brush strokes because we're now painting water. So just like the sky, we can be really abstract with what we're doing. So I would just not overthink it. Make sure you're painting the bottoms when you reach the bottom. And then also wrapping the paint around the sides when you get to the sides as well. What I'm now going to do is just start picking up some of the lighter shade of blue, and I'm just going to start blending that in just above that line. But again, I'm being really choppy with my brush, and I'm just sort of blending it in quite freely. I'm not overthinking it. And I'm going to bring this lighter blue all the way up to meet this line here. Again, don't worry too much about this line at the moment because it's going to be, we're going to go over it slightly with our buildings. We just want to fill up all of this space. So I'm just being careful as I meet that yellow colour, just so I bring it up gently to meet that line. As you can see, I'm being quite scratchy and free with my brush and my brush strokes. What we can now do is just keep going back and picking up some of our darker shades and sort of blending that back in, again just using quite choppy brush strokes. And if you want to, as an option, you can always pick up a little bit of green and then add that and sort of blend it in to the paint that's already on your canvas. Because it's wet, it will blend in quite nicely, and we're just going to do a little dance between the blue, the light blue, and maybe a little bit of green just to add that element into the water. You can be quite thick with your paint. It's quite nice to sort of be thick and jagged with your brush strokes and your paint. And then what you can do is almost just wipe off your brush, just so we haven't got all of these blues on there. So just wipe it off on your kitchen towel, and then you can go back in and pick up a little bit of this pink that we had for the sky. I'm just dashing off some of the excess on the side of my palette, but what you can then start doing is just adding sort of tints of this pink in the water, just so it shows little elements of the reflection from the sky. You You don't have to overthink it, just add it in there, blending it in with that blue. And sort of focusing it more towards this sort of section and leaving this just so it sort of looks a little bit like that's the reflection from the top part of the sky, and the pink is a reflection from the more sunset shades of the sky. So just have a play around with it. If you feel like you've got too much pink on there, or if you don't like it, you can just add the blue straight back on top and blend it out. The great thing about painting the sea and the sky is you can just really experiment with what you're doing. If you don't like it, you can go over it, or you can even let it dry and then go back over it. So you've got quite a lot of freedom with it. And then once you've got that pink in there, you might just want to dab off that from your brush on your kitchen towel. And then you could go back in and pick up some of this lighter yellow. And if you run out, you can just make a little bit more. And then with this, you can focus this maybe just on areas that are slightly nearer the horizon line. We are going to be going over this with some reflections of the buildings, but I just think it's nice to get the sunset reflections in the water as well. So I'm only pushing down very lightly, almost just using the very corner tip of my brush. Could even bring some of this yellow into the sort of pink section. So once you're happy with the reflections in your water, we're just going to leave our canvas to dry for about 5 or 10 minutes just before we move on to our next section. And if you want to speed up the drying process, you can always just give it a little dry with a hairdryer, and that will help speed things up. As soon as your background is nice and dry, we can now move on to creating the shapes and patterns for our skyline and for all of the buildings. So what I would suggest doing is just grabbing your pencil. But what we want to be careful with when using our pencil is it's quite hard to rub out any mistakes once it's drawn onto the paint. So let's just really take our time with this, and we're just going to very lightly sketch out on the horizon line the buildings that we want in our skyline. And then once we've got that all mapped out and we're happy, we'll then go in to create our colour of paint, and then we'll just simply go in, fill them all in, add some shadings and reflections as well. So have a little think about which skyline you want to do. I'm going to be going for London. And then once you've done that, also just the main buildings that you want to include. So I'm going to go for the Wheel, then the Gherkin, the Shard, St. Paul's, the Houses of Parliament. So I'm just going to have those in there, and I'm going to sketch those out first along my skyline, and then the rest of the buildings will just be general buildings, different shapes and sizes to fill in all of the gaps. I'm going to start by sketching in the London Eye. So for this, I've actually got an espresso cup here, which I'm just going to be using to draw around the base of, just to get that nice circular shape. So I would find something that you think works within your painting and just carefully place it onto your canvas, and just with your pencil, just very lightly, just draw around the circumference of the base. Just so we can have a reference for the London Eye. Once you're happy with that shape, we can now just start adding in other elements of our skyline. So here I'm going to add in the gherkin. So just very carefully and very lightly, just adding in that shape of the gherkin. I might just have it coming off the side of my canvas slightly. So I'm just going to draw it around the edge. Again, don't worry too much about these shapes because we are going to be filling them all in. I'm then going to move over to this section more in the middle and just draw the shape for the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben. So essentially, we're just going to break these down into simple shapes. So to start with, I'm just going to draw a rectangle coming out from the base where the C is, going along, and coming back down. And then I'm just going to be adding two sort of tower shapes. So there's one here, and what's nice about sketching these in is once we've sort of got them in there, we can take a step back and decide what we think needs to be a bit bigger or smaller and just amend it slightly. I would always say try and make them smaller than bigger, just because it's easier to make them bigger, obviously, than to make them smaller. So once I've got that main two buildings in, I'm just going to go for the shape of Big Ben. So I'm just going to draw another rectangle shape here. Again, just being very light and almost quite sketchy with my pencil. And please just take your time. And then at the top here, I'm just going to add a square shape. So it's just going to come out slightly. Just build it up slowly. And then at the top of this square, I'm just going to add a triangle. Again, I'm just going to have it sort of come off the side a little bit. So you have that rough shape there. Once we've got that, I'm going to move over here and I'm going to draw in the shape for the shard. So again, that's just a very sort of narrow triangle. And this is going to be the highest building on our skyline. So I would just start from the top just to make sure it's definitely bigger than the Gherkin and the London Eye. I'm going to have it come from about there, I think. I can always make it bigger. Just going to draw a triangular shape all the way down to meet the water. Making sure it's quite thin, especially at the top. And I'm then just going to draw in St. Paul's over here. So that's sort of like a dome shape. So I'm just going to draw in the dome shape to start with, like a semicircle. And then from that, I'm just going to add a sort of rectangle shape along. And then there's a sort of another dome here. Smaller one, so just a smaller semicircle. And just bringing it down. And then at the top, there's another sort of semicircle out the top of this dome. Just going to sketch that in. And then there's sort of a very thin sort of triangle shape coming off. It's almost just a line coming off the top. So once you're happy with the sketch that you've done of your main elements of the skyline, if you're going for London, the London skyline, you can then just start filling in these gaps. So basically these are just other shapes. So I'm just going to do a low kind of building here, and then I might just do a slightly higher building here, and may even have a sort of other turret, maybe just to symbolise the Tower of London. Just with another triangle on top, and then sort of the rectangle shape coming down. And then I might just have a few sort of general skyscraper building blocks. Just at different angles so you can really see once we fill them all in, we'll still be able to see the sunset behind. And then you might just want to do a couple more around here. Maybe a few lower ones. Little square there, and then another rectangle maybe a little bit higher. Maybe even one coming a little bit higher up behind that one. So just start filling it in as you like. And then when we get to the wheel, I'm actually going to have some houses and stuff coming in front of the wheel, but I might just paint them in afterwards, but they're just going to be sort of different shapes, maybe with a few little roofs on the top with that triangle shape. And then here near the gherkin, a couple more rectangles and squares. So as you can see here, we have the main layout of our skyline. Again, don't worry too much about this horizon line at the moment, because once we start adding in the paint, we're just going to bring it down slightly just to crispen it up, and then we'll be adding some reflections of the buildings in the water. But just take your time filling in all of those buildings. There's absolutely no rush whatsoever. Use the pencil just because it's really helpful to get them in there. You can then amend the size if you want to. Just make sure, a couple of rules, your shard is the tallest building on your skyline, and then you've got the other filling in buildings around your main landmarks. As soon as you're happy with the shapes that you've made for your skyline, we're now just going to move over to our palette and create the colour that we want for our silhouette. So this is totally up to you. You might want to do a black silhouette just with black paint. You might want to do more of a grey. You might even want to be really bold and abstract and do a colour. So you might want to do red or pink or green or a darker blue. It's totally up to you what you want to do for your painting. I'm going to go for more of a sort of darker grey shade to start with, just to fill in all of these buildings. And then afterwards, I'll be making a slightly lighter shade of grey just to add a few elements of highlight along the buildings where the light might be hitting them. So just have a little think now about what colour you want to do before we move on to mixing it up. So the one thing I just want to add before we move on to painting in a skyline is just some more detail on the London Eye. So with my pencil, I'm just going to try and find the sort of middle of the circle, and I'm just going to draw a tiny little circle in the middle. And then from this, I just want to add the sort of the spikes that come down, the structural elements where the London Eye is in place. So I'm just going to draw two sort of triangle shapes coming out either side that go down behind the buildings. And then what we can do is we can paint in all of the lines that we need for the spikes of the Ferris wheel, and then we can add in the little carts as well, but we just wanted to get that sort of element in there before we move on. So I'm now going to mix up the grey shade for my buildings. So I'm going to start with the black that I've got here, and I'm just going to add a few scoops of white to it. Don't worry if you've got other colours in your white, because it's all going to get mixed up with the black. And then give it a really good mix. So I'm just going to keep adding the white until I'm happy with the tone that I've got for my buildings. Now I want to go for a grey, but I want it to be slightly lighter. So I'm just going to add the white paint as I go. Just going to add a little bit more white. And I also want to give it a very subtle blue hue. So I'm just going to add in a scoop of blue paint. It's going to be very subtle, but it will be in there. So I'm just mixing in that blue to that grey shade as well. And once you're happy with whatever shade you're going for, just add a couple of drops of water into your mixture, just to keep the paint from drying out too quickly and to give it a nice sort of fluid feel. And just make sure you're mixing in that water really, really well. Once you're happy with your shade, what we're going to do is go back to that same trick that I mentioned at the beginning of just preparing your brush. So pushing the bristles down of the brush, twisting the handle, dragging the paintbrush along to leave that trail, just to allow any of the excess paint to come off your brush, and it just leaves your brush into more of a peak. Equally, you might prefer just sort of dashing the paint off onto your palette and manipulating the bristles so that they go into more of a peak sort of shape. And then as soon as you're ready, we're going to move over to our painting and very carefully start filling it in. Now, I would say if you're right-handed, I would start on the left side and work your way along to the right. And if you're left-handed, start on the right and work your way over to the left, just so we don't smudge anything that we're doing. So I'm going to start over here with my St. Paul's building. And I'm just going to very carefully start painting in the shapes. And this is your chance and opportunity. If you want to amend the shape slightly, you can. We're just going to start filling it in. Take your time, there's no rush with this. It's actually quite therapeutic just because we're essentially just colouring in the lines that we've already drawn. And then when you get to the water, just sort of stop at the top, because afterwards we'll be going in and giving it a nice crisp line underneath. And just wrap the building around your canvas as well, just so we've got that silhouette shade wrapping around the canvas, just like we did with the sky and the water as well. And if ever you feel like your paint is getting dry, then just don't be afraid to add that water back into your mixture, really blend it in, and then go back to your painting. The water really helps give that paint more of a fluid consistency, which is really important when we come to drawing in crisp lines. You'll soon be able to see if your paint is a little bit too dry because it goes quite gristly at the edge where you're wanting to get a nice crisp line. So it needs to be more of an inky-like consistency. So you might find that your paint dries too quickly. So just never be afraid to add that water back in, give it a good mix, and then prepare your brush again. So just take your time filling in all of these elements. And if you want to, you could always leave the really delicate areas till the end, just so you allow yourself to sort of fill in the bigger areas of the painting and the buildings, so you get more of a feel for how you're doing it. And then you can go back in if you want to and fill in all of the detailed sections. So I might just leave that bit until the end and come back to it so I can be really precise with my paintbrush. Whenever you're picking it up, just make sure you're dabbing it off so your brush goes to a nice peak rather than being too thick at the ends. Just helps you create those nice straight lines. because your painting is nice and dry, your sea is nice and dry, you can always just rest your hand on your painting just to steady yourself a little bit. Just make sure you're nice and comfortable before you go in drawing the lines. If you want to get a really nice crisp line, what you could do is just push the bristles of the brush down onto the canvas. Let the bristles fan out slightly and then drag the brush up. And as you can see, it just gives you a nice crisp line along the sides. So you can always practice that if you want to. That's just pushing the bristles down, letting them fan out, and then dragging the brush up, just to give you that nice line along the edges of the buildings. Equally, if you're going for something a little bit more abstract and you don't want to be too neat, then definitely don't worry if your buildings haven't got neat straight lines. This is art at the end of the day. You can do anything you like. And it's actually quite nice sometimes to paint wobbly, abstract skyline scenes. So don't feel like you need to be really, really neat with this if you don't want to be. Again, just remember to add that water back into your paint if you feel like it's drying out. I feel like mine's drying slightly, so I'm just adding that water and just really mixing it in. And then going back into the painting. If ever you feel like you need to sort of turn your canvas around to help you get the right angle, then just feel free to do so. Just make sure you're nice and comfortable and change it around if you think it's going to help. When you come to doing these like very fine details, just use the very, very tip of your brush and just very lightly push down, and that's why it's helpful just to rest your palm on your painting, just so that you can have more control with how much pressure you're putting down on the tip of the paintbrush. And if ever you feel like you need to amend the shape slightly, then just feel free to do so. You can just go over that pencil line and just change up any of the shapes that you feel like you need to, make them slightly bigger and wider if you want to, slightly taller. Then whenever you get to the wheel, you can just very carefully just follow that circle around, just taking your time. Try and do as thin a line as possible, because we can always go back and make it thicker. Again, if your paint's getting a little bit dry, mix that water back into it, really prepare your brush, and then just go back to your London eye and just very carefully go over that circle that we drew. just filling in those structural triangles that we drew, just because these are going to be thicker than the spikes all the way along the wheel. I'm also just going to fill in that circle. I just draw around it to start with and then just carefully fill it in. And then whenever you're ready, you can just start filling in those spikes of the wheel. So you might just want to do it sort of a bit like a pizza shape. So you might just want to start from the middle and very carefully just drag your hand up, just using the very tip of the paintbrush to do so. Another one going down. And then out to either side. Then you could just fill in the gaps. So I'm going to do 2 in between each of the quarters. Once you've filled it all in, you might just want to go back and add in any of the details that you left till the last minute. So I'm just going to go back and just draw in this detail on top of St. Paul's, which is just a line going down. All we're going to do now is just bring the line down slightly along this horizon line, just so we can add a nice crisp line. So I'm just going to draw a very, very thin line using the same colour paint, just to sort of add a little bit more depth to our skyline area. And I'm just pushing down the bristles of the brush onto the canvas and just sort of dragging it along, just to create more of a crisp line here. Once you're happy with that, what you can do as an added extra, if you want to, is just add the little sort of pods onto the London Eye. So for this, I just like doing very small little sort of dabs along the outer section of the wheel. So you can just very gradually just add tiny little, almost like semicircles, just by pushing the brush down onto the canvas. And just pick up more paint as and when you need to. They sort of look like they stick out from the sides, and then as you get to the top, they almost look like they're sitting on top of the wheel. We're now going to move on to adding in a tiny bit of shading to our buildings. So for this, all we want to do is lighten up the grey colour, or whatever colour you've used for your skyline, just slightly using some white paint. So I'm just going to pick up some white and just mixing it into sort of this section here on my palette. You don't need too much, it just needs to be a shade lighter than your previous colour. Again, just add a tiny drop of water to it. And it's only going to be subtle, but what we're going to do with this, just preparing our brush like we did before, is just add sort of little touches and hints of sort of highlight into our buildings. So for example, here along St. Paul's, I might just add a little bit of a dash, just rounding it where the dome is, and then maybe just along the top here, and then along the top of that dome, maybe bringing it down slightly. And then on the shard, I'm going to do the same along this side, thinking that sort of the reflection is coming from this angle. And this is only very, very subtle. It's just a nice sort of hint that we've added a little bit more depth to our buildings. So I'm just going to do a little line here, maybe on the top of this section. Just carefully just add in this lighter shade along some of the areas of your buildings. You can almost just keep with the shapes that you've already made. So I'm sort of going along the top here, maybe even draw a line down so I can sort of see the different shapes of each building. It's only very subtle. You can just sort of see it there. And if you feel like you want to lighten up your shade even more, you could always just add a tiny little bit more white to it. Lighten up slightly more, and then maybe just go back over some of the areas just so you've got an extra sort of pop of highlight. And you can be quite free with this, quite abstract with your brush strokes. Just sort of try and keep the shape of those buildings as a guide. What we're going to do as a finishing touch is just add a few touches of reflection from our buildings in our water. So all we want to do is use the same colour that we've used for our buildings, but we just want to water it down slightly. So I'm just going to add a few drops of water onto this mixture and give it a really, really good mix. We want it to be nice and fluid. When we come to drawing on our reflections, we can just be quite free with it, and it's almost just more of an ink consistency. So just make sure that you're happy with how much water you've added to your paint before we do this bit. And then all we're going to do is just focus under the buildings and just use a very light touch, just the very, very tip of your paintbrush. And you can just start adding very light dashes in the water just underneath where these buildings are. Just trying to keep in mind the shape and the size of the building. So this one's just going to reflect to about here. And then I might just try and do the sort of dome-like effect with the little line. And then the shard here, again, will just be more of sort of triangle-like shape, maybe with the sort of line coming down. So we're just going to start very gradually, just building up these reflections. If you feel like you've got too much paint on your brush, just wash some of it off, dab it off on your kitchen towel, prepare your brush again, and then go back in, just so you've got like quite a thin consistency with your paint for this reflection. It almost needs to be more watery than paint. Try not to overthink it too much either, just keep with that rough sort of shape of the buildings. We can always go back in and build it up, but the water's going to be naturally quite rippled and there's going to be movement in there, so it doesn't need to be a complete representation, it just needs to be a suggestion. And then with the London Eye, you can just try and keep that sort of circular-like shape in mind as you're doing these dashes. And if you want to, you can just add some more water to your brush, just dab off the excess so it doesn't drip. And then you can always just go back in there with more of a watery consistency on your brush, just to slightly merge in these lines, just to give it even more of a reflective kind of feel. If you can, just try and get some of the shapes in there just so it mirrors where the buildings are. It just adds a nice touch to the painting. So wherever you've got a turret or a spike, just sort of try and add that in there. I'm just going back in and just adding a little bit more of the darker shade of grey just underneath the buildings, just where that line meets that water, just to sort of soften it out slightly. So this is your moment to just take a little step back from your painting, decide if there's anything else that you want to add or tweak slightly. But I would say if you're happy, then step away from your painting, put down the paintbrush and just let it dry nicely.
As soon as you're happy with all of the details that you have added to your painting, you have then completed your London Skyline masterpiece. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope that you enjoyed that and that you're pleased you have some new art for your living room walls. Thanks everyone. Bye.